All right, brothers and sisters, I want to recap very quickly what we were talking about last week. I was kind of done with this particular topic, but then I was thinking this week, Lee's like, oh, what are you going to do? And I'm like, I don't know, I'm bouncing some stuff off my head. And then I'm like, well, I didn't really cover like some of the most important interactions of Jesus and the Gentiles. Like we stopped kind of with Jesus up in the north, right? As we talked about, he starts his ministry, boom, he goes out into the wilderness, which was always associated with evil and wickedness in Jewish theology. He also goes straight up north, which was also a place where the Jews felt wickedness came from. And we know that that's the case, actually, because all of the major invasions of Israel and Judah all began in the north, from Assyria all the way to the Romans as well. Remember, the Romans actually didn't go straight to Jerusalem when they took it in AD 70. They actually started up in the Galilee. That's where they started, up in Nazareth area. And they laid waste to the north, because that's where all the trouble was, and then they slowly moved down, just wasting the whole land and eventually destroying Jerusalem. So anyways, that's kind of the mindset. Jesus goes straight up north, really, and this is where he interacts primarily with the Gentiles, which is understandable. The closer you got to Jerusalem, brothers and sisters, the less diverse, ethnically diverse, and religiously diverse the people got. Much more, ethnic Jews following Judaism, that type of thing. The further north you went, the less of that took place. In fact, and I think we talked about this, the northern part of Israel always had, this reputation of being kind of like the Wild West, and really not following Judaism, had their own ways of thinking, that type of thing. So, anyways, so we covered that. We covered this as well, the Roman centurion, and I want you to keep this in mind because, the Roman centurion, I was thinking about this the other day. The Roman centurion was the backbone of the Roman army, and it really symbolized the strength of Rome, the hated Romans. If it wasn't for the centurions, you wouldn't have, the structure and the cohesion that the Roman legions were known for. They really kind of kept things, straight and ordered. They were kind of like the sergeants of like the U.S. Army or something like that. If you don't have sergeants and people kind of running the show at a lower level, things are just going to fall apart. But he had taken to Jewish life. He was a friend of the Jews, as Mark and Matthew tell us, that he helped the Jewish people in Capernaum. And so that needs to be taken in consideration because not all Roman soldiers were the same. There were different types of Roman soldiers, particularly centurions. Some of them, which they were very elitist, they were Romans and everyone else was down here. But a lot of soldiers, brothers and sisters, not even just centurions, like the regular run-of-the-mill soldier, right? Oftentimes he would take a foreign wife, from that area. So did this centurion have a Jewish wife? We don't know. This is all speculation. But it was very, very common for Roman soldiers that were in an area for a long period of time, like up in London or something like that. The Romans are up in London. They would marry a lot of the local women, and that happened throughout history, and it really continues to happen. But anyways, it's like the United States has a base in Germany, has had a base in Germany, several bases in Germany since the end of World War II because of the Cold War and kind of the friction and that type of thing. It is very well known in the Army that a lot of guys go over there, right, and they marry a German woman, right? It happened constantly. And so, it really was concerning to the Army as well, what that dynamic was going to be, that you had a lot of these American soldiers going over to Germany. While they're on the base, they meet up with a, beautiful German woman, boom, now they're here in Germany, and, so it can be complicated. But anyways, once the Roman centurion was out of the service, which was 25 to 30 years, that was your contract. Once that happened, you got land. Okay, and that was the big thing. You had your own land. You were free to be a farmer. A lot of these people stayed in that area. A lot of these Roman centurions and the Roman soldiers, when they retired, they stayed in that general area. Why? Well, their families were there. They had wives, they had children, they had extended families, that type of thing. Unofficially, like, if you were a soldier in Rome, you weren't supposed to be married. All right, but people, they didn't technically get married, right? They didn't have a service or anything like that, but they just kind of started living together and things happened. So anyways, we also have the Samaritan woman up in the north as well, the Syrophoenician woman. And also remember that Jesus is going to start his ministry by making the comparison between Gentile believers and Jewish believers. And he uses two examples, right? The widow. There were many widows in the time of Elijah, he says. But he was sent to a Gentile one. There were many lepers, Jesus says, in the time of Naaman. Only one was cleansed, and he was a Gentile. So Jesus, with the start of his ministry, brothers and sisters, is already planting the seed of the gospel message of hope. Yes, his first role was to the lost sheep of the 12 tribes of Israel. That was his first goal, his first mission. But an underlying mission was to plant the seeds of salvation to the Gentiles that had contact already with the Jewish people and with Jewish culture and religion. And that's where we are. Now, I wanna focus today, this morning, on a couple things. Jesus and the Gentiles as it relates to Jesus clearing the court of the Gentiles. All right? And so this story is found in all four Gospels. What does that tell us? Probably important. Right? And sometimes with the Gospels there's differences. Like we're going to find that Mark interjects something very interesting that I totally missed in my 50 plus years of reading the Bible, right? I missed that, and it kind of. All right, so let's take a look at this event, and just have some thoughts about it in relationship to Jesus' ministry, particularly to the Gentiles. The first thing I want to mention is Solomon's temple had no court of the Gentiles. Okay, that can mean one of two things. It means that originally God didn't want any court of the Gentiles, that he wanted all nations to come to him, to sacrifice to him. The doors of salvation through the temple worship were open to all mankind. That's one option. Number two, the other option is that through history, particularly with the building of Herod's temple, there was a place set aside for the Gentiles to keep them separate from the Jews, to exclude them from full worship to Yahweh with the temple. We'll see. Maybe the Old Testament can kind of shed some light on that. So let's take a look at this. And I know I'm jumping halfway down here, but I probably should have put that up front. Let's take a look at 2 Chronicles, the 6th chapter. This is the dedication of Solomon's temple, and there's a couple things I'd like to point out in the 6th chapter. Beginning in verse 32, it reads, "Moreover, concerning the stranger, which is not of thy people Israel, but is come from a far country for thy great name's sake, and thy mighty hand, and thy stretched out arm, if they come and pray to this house, then hear thou from the heavens, even from the dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger calleth to thee for, that all people of the earth may know thy name, and fear thee, as doth thy people Israel, and may know that this house which I have built is called by thy name." Okay, so that is a call for all people to come. And they're coming with their sacrifices. They're coming with their pleas to God, right? Hear them, Solomon says. Listen to them. All right, so let's take a look at Isaiah. So there was a thought, right? God's original purpose, it seems like, is not to exclude Gentiles that are interested in Yahweh, that want to worship Yahweh, but to bring them to the temple, originally. Okay? In Isaiah, well, Isaiah has some things to say as well. Isaiah 56. Isaiah 56, 6 and 7. Well, let's look at 5. Even unto them will I give in mine house and within my name my walls, a place and a name better than of sons and of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Also the sons of the stranger that join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to keep his servants, every one that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and taketh hold of my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifice shall be accepted from mine altar. For mine house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. Okay? Jesus is going to actually quote that as he clears the temple. Okay? But look at the context of this chapter, brothers and sisters. This chapter is not one of exclusion. It is one of inclusion. So the original purpose of the temple was not just so Jewish people could go and worship. It was to be a house of prayer for all nations. So there was no need under Solomon's temple to have a court of the Gentiles. Why? Why have a court of the Gentiles? Why divide Jew and Gentile when there was no real division, particularly in, as we've seen in 2 Chronicles and also in Isaiah? Okay, God's original intent was for everybody to come and worship. My house shall be a house of prayer for all people. All right, so we're getting into kind of the mind of Christ here. Why was he so upset? Well, originally under Solomon's system, there was no court of the Gentiles. But now through, kind of the centuries, and we can understand this, by the way, because remember, under Nehemiah and Ezra, they had a real problem with Gentile thinking coming in, not observing the Sabbath day. You had intermarriage between different groups of people to the point where the identity of the Jewish people, they just came back into the land, was almost lost. Why? Because they were speaking in different languages. You lose your language, you lose your culture, as a fact. And so that's why Hebrew obviously is still spoken, because they understood that if you lose the language, your culture is really tied up in your language to a lot of degrees. Okay, so that leaves us with Jesus now, during this time, seeing something or witnessing something that does not kind of coincide with the thought of his Father. And so let's try to get a picture of this. The court of the Gentiles was a massive area. And it was an area before going into the actual sanctuary. And as we're going to find out, it was very regulated to the point where there was death involved if a Gentile went into the sanctuary, into the holy area. Okay, they were not allowed in there at all. And when Herod was building this area, he purposely, the interior of these walls were built only by priests that had been trained in masonry work. Okay, so before then, the Gentile workers were kind of building all around this massive complex. But to keep it pure, the wall separating the Jews from the Gentiles was built by Jewish priests that had learned masonry, the tricks of the trade, so to speak. And so Herod did that because he didn't want Gentile workers working on the interior part of the temple. Interesting. It's one of these things where Herod does these little things to keep them, to keep himself, on the good graces of the Jews at that time. All right. So let's take a look at Mark, the 11th chapter, the actual events. In the 15th verse. And they came to Jerusalem. And Jesus went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seat of them that sold doves. So there's a couple things here in this account. He goes in, there's no mention of the court of the Gentiles here, is there, brothers and sisters? It doesn't say that Jesus went into the court of the Gentiles. It said he went into the temple, right? He went up to the temple complex. So is this kind of a hint of, God's judgment on the whole system of the court of the Gentiles? Why is there a court of the Gentiles? The other thing is, too, that it's massive, and so it wasn't really conducive, this area, for prayer. Think about what's going on out here. You have a massive area, maybe 2 to 3, maybe even 4 football fields long, okay? And you have all kinds of stalls, all kinds of animals, people clamoring, people fighting about money, the money changes, this, that, and the other. It was hectic. It was noisy. It was smelly, right? There's animal poop everywhere, animal urine everywhere. This is your prayer area, Gentiles. Right? So that bothered Jesus. They had taken this area now, and it was desecrated. And the place that had been given to the Gentiles under this new system, by the way, they weren't keeping it open. There was no place for the Gentiles to go pray because it had been taken over by the animal stalls, by the money changers, this type of thing. When that happened, we're not told, but that really bothered Jesus. And there's a couple of reasons why. It mentions here doves, okay? In the 12th chapter of Mark, just one chapter later, in the 40th, he says in verse 38, and he said unto them in his doctrine, beware of the scribes which love to go in long clothing and love salutations in the marketplaces, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and the uppermost rooms at feasts, which devour widows' houses, and make a pretense, and for a pretense make long prayers. These shall receive greater damnation. Doves is one of the things that is mentioned here, and doves were what the poor would give to God as a sacrifice. In fact, it was one of the things when Jesus was brought to the temple for the purification sacrifice. 2 turtle doves, right? That was Mary's purification offering. Why? Well, they couldn't afford a bigger animal. They couldn't afford a lamb, or something like that. And so the turtle doves were mentioned here. And the turtle doves as well was something that the poor widows would go, and they would get a dove, which was the cheapest thing you could get as an offering, and offer it to God. And so the most vulnerable, or one of the most vulnerable groups of people in the ancient world, the widows, were being ripped off by the money changers, right? This is also around that remember the widow put in the 2 mites? Remember that? And Jesus had a parable about that the widow had given everything that she had to God. He had compassion for these people. I'm sure he saw, his mother struggling as well. He had lived poverty. He understood it. And so for him to see the establishment, the temple establishment, with tens of millions of dollars ripping off widows, it enraged him. It enraged him. And this is why he says, my house shall be called of nations a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. And just so keep that in mind, and let's look at Jeremiah, the 7th chapter, for a little more detail about what was going on in the temple at this time. In the 7th chapter of Jeremiah, in the 11th verse. Verse 6. If ye oppress not the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, and shed not innocent blood in this place, neither walk ye after other gods to your hurt. Right? And so this is part of what was going on, that you have made it a den of thieves. You were oppressing the stranger. You're oppressing the fatherless, the widow. You're shedding innocent blood in this place. And so these are the things we talk about. Well, why is Jesus kind of driving out, all of these people? It was an offense to his Father. It was an offense to God. What was going on here? They had taken a very sacred process, and they had corrupted it. And the people that they should have been saving, that should have been watching over the fatherless and the widow, they were ripping them off by charging them crazy amounts of money to change their money into either Jewish coins or Phoenician coins, and that's how they made their money, through money changes. Let me see. In verse 11, is this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers in your eyes? And so in verse 9, will ye steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and burn incense unto Baal, and walk after other gods whom ye knew not, and come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered to do all these abominations? So that was their mindset. They thought that the ritual nature of sacrifices and of the temple were going to save them from all of their bad habits, all of their wickedness that was going on. They felt this. They believed this. And so that very thought process now, the corruption that was during the time of Solomon, very same corruption, even worse now during the time of Herod. And so it's obviously concerning. And so if we go back to Mark, in verse 17, verse 16, in the seed, the money changes, he overturns, and would not. Here's a verse that I've read probably dozens and dozens of times, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. So, by the way, brothers and sisters, this just wasn't Jesus that was doing this. I will guarantee you 100% that the disciples were absolutely involved in this, right? It wasn't just Jesus. That if you have the ability to kind of overturn money changes and that type of thing, this just wasn't Jesus doing these things. The disciples were there as well, and whether or not they were doing things like turning things over, they were there to protect Jesus as well. And in verse 16, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. So he's physically preventing people to bringing their wares up into the court of the Gentiles, which is interesting. I never realized that. So this obviously caused kind of a great upheaval. And some historians have said, and some scholars have said, that Jesus did this a couple times. He did this a couple times. And each time he never got arrested. Why didn't Jesus get arrested after doing this? Well, the people agreed with him. The people were on his side when they saw this. They're like, yes, we're getting ripped off. Every time we go to a sacrifice, these people are ripping us off. And so, it was a popular uprising in a certain way. That Jesus was bringing about, these corrupting practices, and he's putting it right into the face of the Jewish leaders at that time. It's pretty interesting. Okay, now, there's also another event that has to do with this, and this is Paul being arrested and charged with bringing a Gentile into the sanctuary. So, this this continues now with Paul. And we know Paul, Paul was kind of in two camps for a while. I shouldn't say that. He was brought up, at the feet of Gamaliel. He knew everything about Jewish history, about Jewish culture, about Jewish religion. He had memorized the whole Old Testament. Memorized it. Didn't need a book to read it. He memorized it. And so, he's at a point where back in the day, he would have killed people for a Gentile coming into the sanctuary. But let's take a look at it in Acts 21. In the 27th verse, 21, 27. Uh, 21, 27. Yeah. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him, verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all of Jerusalem was in an uproar. So, things went to 0 to 100 pretty quickly. When, now Paul didn't do this, by the way. It was like a kind of a false statement that they were making, lies. But you can understand, too, that, people are getting word that Paul is baptizing in the name of Jesus. And then, he's still in the temple. He's talking about doing away of the temple. Christ, the temple is going to be destroyed. You've got to follow Christ. And the Jews are like, what are you talking about? And it was very difficult, too, for those early Christian converts from a Jewish background. They were still struggling. Like, we don't have to keep the law anymore. All of these rituals, we don't have to. Like, it blew their mind, and there was a struggle with them, because there were priests within the early Christian community that were promoting, saying, you have to follow the law of Moses or you cannot be saved. So that's really where the struggle was. And now you have, this Greek. Paul is bringing Greeks now into the temple. This is what we're talking about. This sect is crazy. We got to do something about it. And they would have known Paul as well, right? Paul was in and out of that temple for years and years and years. He was well known to these people. And so you can see the reaction, brothers and sisters. It wasn't just like, hey, we're going to give you a warning, guys. You can't go in here. It was immediate death. And this is borne out historically. It's borne out historically, as we're going to see. Okay, last verse. Paul is going to use this as well as an example of Jesus breaking down walls between Jew and Gentile as it relates to salvation. In Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, verse 15. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace, so that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereof, and come and preached peace to you, which were afar off, and to them that were nigh. And so, in verse 15, we're talking about, in verse 14, for he is our peace, who hath made both one and hath broken down the middle wall of partition. And so that middle wall of partition, brothers and sisters, was the wall that divided the Jews from the Gentiles. And what does Paul say? He has broken down that wall. There is no more court of the Gentiles. There's no more Jewish exclusive area. Nope. Just like it was rent, the veil was rent from top to bottom. Same with the wall of perdition. It was taken down.